You're about to watch how a single lie can destroy a life, unless the truth decides to fight back. The courthouse doors slammed open harder than they needed to, echoing through the marble hallway like a warning no one understood yet, and every head turned at once as Officer Daniel Brooks stepped inside with one hand gripping the arm of a woman he had already decided was guilty, his posture rigid, his jaw tight, his confidence almost rehearsed, while Naomi Carter walked beside him in silence, her wrists restrained, her steps steady, her face unreadable in a way that made people uncomfortable, without knowing why. And that discomfort spread quickly through the room like a quiet ripple because something about her didn't match the story that had already been told about her. Not the way she held her shoulders, not the way her eyes scanned the room as if she were observing rather than being judged, and yet no one questioned it out loud because Daniel's voice cut through the tension before doubt had time to grow, loud enough for everyone to hear. This is her, the one I told you about. And just like that, the narrative locked into place. Whispers started, subtle at first, then sharper, people leaning toward each other, forming conclusions without evidence, because that's how quickly perception becomes reality when authority speaks first. And Naomi didn't interrupt, didn't defend herself, didn't even flinch when the prosecutor glanced over with thinly veiled skepticism, as if she had already been reduced to a case file before the hearing even began. And for a moment, just a moment, there was something almost unsettling about how calm she was, like she was waiting, not hoping, not fearing, just waiting, and Daniel noticed it too, his eyes narrowing slightly as he leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough so only she could hear. "No one's coming to save you," he said, the words meant to land heavy, to break whatever quiet strength she was holding on to. But Naomi didn't react the way he expected. She didn't look away, didn't tense. Instead, the smallest hint of a smile touched the corner of her lips, so subtle it could have been missed, but Daniel saw it. And for a split second, something shifted inside him, something he couldn't quite explain, a flicker of irritation, or maybe uncertainty, but it vanished just as quickly as it came, buried under the certainty he had built this entire case on, because everything was in place, every report signed, every statement aligned, every detail polished enough to hold up under scrutiny. At least that's what he believed, and that belief made him louder, sharper, more aggressive as he guided her forward, presenting her not as a person, but as proof of his own authority. And the courtroom responded exactly as expected, the judge barely looking up, the clerk shuffling papers, the quiet hum of routine swallowing the weight of what was actually unfolding. But then something small, almost invisible, interrupted the rhythm. A man seated in the second row shifted in his seat, his eyes locking onto Naomi for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, his expression unreadable, before he quickly looked away, and it was subtle, so subtle that no one acknowledged it, except Naomi, whose gaze flickered toward him just briefly, like she had been expecting it, and then just as quickly, she returned to stillness, hands resting calmly, breathing steady, as if the entire room were moving around her instead of against her, and Daniel missed it. Or maybe he chose to ignore it, because by then he was already stepping forward, already speaking again, already reinforcing the version of reality he needed everyone else to believe. "We caught her with evidence," he said, his voice firm, controlled, practiced, and the words hung in the air, heavy with assumption. But Naomi finally spoke, her voice calm, almost too calm for the situation, cutting through the noise without needing to rise. "Are you sure about that?" And the room didn't react immediately, but something changed, not visibly, not dramatically, just enough to make the silence feel different, heavier, like it was holding something back, and Daniel felt it again. That same flicker, that same brief hesitation he couldn't explain, but instead of stopping, instead of questioning it, he doubled down, because backing off wasn't an option anymore. Not now, not in front of everyone, not after everything he had already set in motion, and he had no idea that in less than a few minutes, every word he had just spoken was about to come back and unravel everything he thought he controlled. The silence did not break all at once. It stretched, thin and fragile, like something waiting to snap, and every second Naomi Carter remained standing there without reacting made the room more uncomfortable than any outburst ever could, because people expected denial, they expected fear, they expected something they could understand, But what they got instead was stillness, controlled and deliberate, and it forced eyes to linger longer than they should have, forced minds to question something they had already accepted as fact. And Daniel Brooks felt it spreading, that subtle shift in attention, the way the room was no longer fully his. So he moved quickly to take it back, stepping forward with a sharper tone. "The evidence speaks for itself," he said, louder now, as if volume alone could reinforce certainty. And the prosecutor nodded slightly, flipping through the file as though everything inside it had already been decided long before this moment. But Naomi's gaze did not follow the papers. It stayed on Daniel, steady and unblinking, and there was something in that look that did not match the situation, something that did not belong to someone who was losing control. And that was when the judge finally leaned forward, tapping the desk lightly, not with urgency, but with the casual authority of someone who believed this was routine. "Miss Carter, you will have a chance to respond," he said, though his tone carried little interest in what that response might be. And again, that expectation settled over the room, that assumption that whatever she said would change nothing. But Naomi did not rush to speak. She let the silence stretch just a little longer, long enough for it to become noticeable, long enough for a few people to shift in their seats. And then she did something unexpected. She glanced briefly toward the back of the courtroom, not searching, not reacting, just acknowledging. And it was quick, almost imperceptible, but not invisible, because the same man from earlier straightened slightly, his posture changing in a way that suggested readiness, not surprise. And then just as quickly, Naomi looked forward again, as if nothing had happened, and Daniel caught it this time. That small exchange, that flicker of connection, and it irritated him more than it should have, because it did not fit into the version of events he had constructed. So he cut in before she could speak. "There is nothing to explain," he said, sharper now, stepping closer, reclaiming the space. "We found what we needed." And again, those words landed heavily, but not as cleanly as before, because now there was hesitation in the room, subtle, quiet, but growing. And Naomi finally spoke again, her voice even, measured, almost patient. "You found what you were looking for," she said, and that distinction, small as it sounded, landed differently, like it carried weight beyond the words themselves. And a faint murmur moved through the room before quickly dying down, because people were not sure what they had just heard, but they felt it, that something was slightly off, slightly incomplete, and the judge frowned just enough to acknowledge it, his attention sharpening by a fraction. "What exactly are you suggesting?" he asked, and for the first time, Naomi shifted her posture, not dramatically, just enough to signal that she was no longer simply standing there. She was engaging, and yet she still did not reveal anything. She did not defend herself directly. She did not challenge the charges outright. Instead, she asked a question, calm and precise. "Before we continue, has everyone in this room reviewed the full report?" And that question should have been simple, routine even, but the way she asked it, the timing, the confidence, it created a ripple of uncertainty that no one could immediately explain, and Daniel felt it hit him harder than the others, because he knew that report better than anyone, or at least he thought he did, every page, every detail, every signature exactly where it needed to be. And yet for a split second, doubt crept in, not about the report itself, but about why she was asking, why she sounded so certain, and why she did not seem even remotely concerned about the outcome. And that was when the clerk hesitated, just barely, flipping through the documents again as if checking something that had already been checked, and the pause was brief, almost invisible, but it was enough. Enough for the tension to shift again, enough for the room to lean into something they could not yet see. And Naomi simply waited, watching, as if she already knew what that hesitation meant, while Daniel stood there, still holding on to control, but no longer completely certain that it belonged to him. And somewhere in the back of the room, a quiet click echoed softly, so faint it could have been dismissed as nothing, but Naomi heard it. And this time, she allowed herself the smallest breath of anticipation, because whatever was coming next, it had already begun. The sound of that quiet click did not echo loudly, but it lingered just enough to feel intentional. And for a moment no one moved. No one spoke, as if the entire courtroom had collectively sensed that something unseen had just shifted into place. And Naomi Carter did not look surprised. She did not turn toward the sound. She did not acknowledge it at all, but the stillness in her posture changed, becoming more grounded, more certain, like someone who had just received confirmation without needing to hear the words. And Daniel Brooks felt it again, sharper this time, that subtle loss of control slipping through his fingers. So he stepped forward once more, forcing the moment back into something familiar, something structured. "Your Honor, we are wasting time," he said, his voice tight now, less measured than before. "The facts are clear." And the judge nodded slightly, as if eager to restore order, glancing down at the file again. But there was hesitation now, not enough to stop the process, but enough to slow it, enough to make every movement feel heavier than it should have. And Naomi finally shifted her hands slightly, the smallest movement, yet it drew attention immediately because it was the first visible sign that she was about to act. And when she spoke again, her voice carried a different weight, not louder, not sharper, but more deliberate. "Then let us make sure we are all looking at the same facts," she said, and the way she said it made the room pause again. Because it was not a defense, it was not an argument, it was an invitation, and invitations are dangerous when you do not know what you are stepping into. And Daniel felt that more than anyone, his jaw tightening as he turned toward the clerk. "We have already submitted everything," he insisted, but the clerk did not immediately respond, flipping through the documents once more, slower now, as if something did not quite align, and the pause stretched, thin and uncomfortable, until finally the clerk spoke, uncertain. "There is an additional file here." And that single sentence landed harder than anything that had been said so far, because it introduced something new, something unaccounted for, and Daniel's head snapped slightly toward the desk, confusion flashing across his face before he could hide it. "That is not possible," he said quickly, too quickly. And Naomi did not interrupt. She did not react. She simply watched, allowing the moment to unfold on its own. And that was when the man in the second row stood up, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with quiet authority. And every eye in the room turned toward him as he adjusted his jacket, his expression calm but focused. And for a second, no one understood why he was standing, until he spoke. "Your Honor, that file should be reviewed before any decision is made." His voice steady, professional, and the room shifted again, because this was no longer a contained interaction between an officer and a defendant. This was something broader, something more structured, and the judge hesitated, looking between Daniel and the man, uncertainty creeping into his posture. "And you are?" the judge asked, and the man did not hesitate. "Federal oversight," he replied simply, and that phrase alone changed the air in the room, because it carried weight. It carried implications that no one could ignore, and Daniel felt it hit him like a sudden drop in temperature, his confidence faltering just enough to be noticeable now. "This is not a federal matter," he said, trying to regain control, but the words did not land the way they had before, because now there was doubt. Now there were eyes watching him differently, and Naomi finally moved, not stepping forward, not raising her voice, but lifting her gaze directly toward the judge, her calm now unmistakably deliberate. "I believe it is," she said, and the silence that followed was no longer empty. It was charged, waiting, and the judge slowly reached for the additional file, his movements careful, almost cautious, as if he understood that whatever was inside might change everything. And Daniel stood frozen for just a fraction too long, his mind racing through possibilities he could not fully grasp, because this was not part of the plan. This was not supposed to happen, and Naomi simply watched him, her expression steady, knowing, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment all along. And as the judge opened the file, the first page catching the light, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, because whatever was written there was about to decide who had been telling the truth all along. And for the first time since this began, Daniel was no longer certain that it was him. The faint rustle of paper as the judge turned the first page sounded louder than it should have, like the entire room had been stripped down to that single moment, and every pair of eyes followed the movement of his hand, as if the truth itself was being revealed line by line. But the judge did not speak immediately, his expression tightening just slightly as his eyes scanned across the document. And that hesitation, that pause, stretched longer than anyone expected, long enough for the air in the courtroom to feel heavier, thicker, harder to breathe in, and Daniel Brooks felt it settle in his chest. that unfamiliar weight of uncertainty pressing in where confidence used to be. So he stepped forward again, faster this time, almost cutting into the silence. "Your Honor, that file has not been verified," he said, his voice firm but edged now. "We should proceed with the evidence already submitted." And it sounded reasonable, it sounded controlled, but it also sounded like someone trying to steer the moment away from something he could not control. And that difference did not go unnoticed, because now people were listening differently, not just to what was being said, but to how it was being said, and the judge did not immediately respond, his eyes still moving across the page, slower now, more deliberate, as if each word carried more weight than the last. And Naomi Carter remained exactly where she was, calm, still, her gaze steady on the front of the room. But there was something new in her presence, something subtle yet undeniable, a quiet shift from observation to certainty, as if the outcome she had been waiting for was finally beginning to surface, and Daniel saw it. That same composure that had unsettled him from the beginning. But now it felt different, now it felt intentional, and that realization made his voice sharper when he spoke again. "This is a distraction," he insisted, turning slightly toward the judge, but before the judge could answer, the man who had identified himself as federal oversight stepped forward just enough to be noticed again, not interrupting, not raising his voice, but placing himself in a position that made ignoring him impossible. With respect, "Your Honor, the contents of that file are directly relevant," he said, and there was no hesitation in his tone, no uncertainty, only quiet authority, and that authority carried weight in a way that Daniel could not easily dismiss. And for the first time, the balance in the room began to shift visibly, not in a dramatic way, but in small, undeniable movements. The way the prosecutor leaned back slightly instead of forward, the way the clerk stopped flipping pages and simply waited, the way the judge adjusted his posture as if preparing to reconsider something he had already decided. And Naomi did not move, but her eyes followed those shifts, tracking them with precision, as if each one confirmed something she had already known. And then the judge finally spoke, his voice slower now, less certain than before. "Officer Brooks, this document raises questions," he said, and those words landed harder than any accusation, because they introduced doubt into a space that had been built on certainty, and Daniel felt it immediately, his mind racing through possibilities, trying to understand how something like this could exist, how something he had not accounted for could suddenly appear at the center of everything. "What questions?" he asked, but there was tension in his voice now, not controlled, not measured, and the judge glanced down again, as if choosing his words carefully. "It suggests that the timeline of your report may not align with the surveillance logs," he said, and the room reacted instantly, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a collective shift, a subtle intake of breath, a quiet realization that something was not adding up, and Daniel shook his head slightly, stepping forward again. "That is not possible," he said, but this time the words sounded different, less like a statement of fact, and more like an attempt to hold on to something slipping away. And Naomi finally turned her head slightly, just enough to look directly at him, and there was no anger in her expression, no frustration, only a calm certainty that made the moment feel even heavier. And when she spoke, her voice was steady, almost gentle. "Are you sure about that?" she repeated, and this time the question did not sound rhetorical. It sounded final, and Daniel felt it land deeper than before, because now there was evidence on the table. Now there were eyes questioning him, instead of trusting him. And for the first time since he had walked into that courtroom, he was no longer standing on solid ground. And as the judge turned to the next page, his expression tightening further, the quiet realization began to spread through the room that whatever came next was not going to support the story Daniel had built. And Naomi Carter, still standing in silence, knew that this was only the beginning of everything about to unravel. The second page turned more slowly than the first, as if the judge already understood that whatever came next would not be easy to say out loud. And the faint sound of paper sliding against paper seemed to echo through the courtroom in a way that made people lean forward without realizing it, drawn into a moment that no longer felt routine, and Daniel Brooks could feel it slipping now, not all at once, but in pieces, small fractures forming in the certainty he had built. So he spoke again, quicker this time, before the silence could settle too deeply. "There has to be a mistake in that log," he said, his tone sharper, less controlled. "Surveillance systems are not always accurate." And it was a reasonable argument, one that might have worked minutes ago, but now it landed differently. Now it sounded like explanation instead of authority, and the judge did not immediately accept it, his eyes still scanning the document, his brow tightening just enough to signal that something was not aligning. "This is not a minor discrepancy," he said slowly, choosing each word with care. "According to this record, you were already inside the evidence room before the item in question was logged as discovered, and that sentence did not need to be loud to carry weight. It settled over the room with quiet precision, and the reaction was immediate, not dramatic, but unmistakable. A shift in posture, a pause in breathing, a subtle realization spreading from one person to the next that the timeline did not just have a gap, it had a contradiction, and Daniel felt it hit him fully now. That moment where control does not just weaken but begins to turn against you. And he shook his head again, more firmly this time. "That is not possible," he repeated, but the repetition did not strengthen his position. It exposed it, and Naomi Carter watched him closely, her expression unchanged, but her attention sharper, as if she were measuring the exact point where certainty turned into doubt. And she did not interrupt. She did not press. She allowed the moment to expand, because pressure builds best in silence. And the judge flipped to the next section, his movements more deliberate now, more cautious, as if each new detail carried the potential to shift the entire case. And then he stopped, his eyes narrowing slightly. "There is also a discrepancy in the officer's statement," he added, and this time the words carried a different tone, less questioning, more concerned. "The description of where the item was found does not match the recorded footage." And that was the moment the room changed again, more noticeably this time, because now it was not just one inconsistency. It was a pattern, and patterns are harder to dismiss, harder to explain away. And Daniel felt his chest tighten, his mind moving faster, trying to find a way to reframe the situation, to regain control. But every second he waited made it worse. So he stepped forward again, his voice rising slightly despite his effort to contain it. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this is being taken out of context," he said. But even as he spoke, the words felt thinner, less solid, because context only works when people still trust the source, and that trust was already shifting, already cracking. And Naomi finally moved again, just a small step forward, enough to draw attention without breaking her composure. And when she spoke, her voice carried that same calm clarity that had unsettled him from the beginning. "Then maybe we should look at the full context," she said. And this time, there was no mistaking it. She was not reacting. She was guiding, and the difference hit the room all at once, subtle but undeniable. Because now the question was no longer whether something was wrong, but how much had been hidden, and the man from federal oversight stepped slightly closer again, not interrupting, not asserting, but reinforcing her presence simply by standing where he did. And Daniel saw it. Saw the alignment forming, saw the way the room was beginning to shift around her instead of him, and for the first time, a thought crossed his mind that he could not immediately dismiss. Not fully, not completely. What if she had known this would happen? And that thought lingered longer than it should have, because it did not fit into anything he had prepared for. And as the judge closed the file for a brief moment, his expression no longer neutral, no longer indifferent, but focused, almost cautious, the atmosphere in the courtroom settled into something entirely different, something heavier, something that felt less like a hearing and more like the beginning of something much larger. And Naomi Carter, still standing with that same quiet control, knew that the truth had not been revealed yet, not fully, but it was close enough now that no one in that room could walk away unchanged. The room did not erupt into chaos. It did something far more unsettling. It grew quiet in a way that felt deliberate, as if every person inside understood that something important was unfolding and no one wanted to be the one who missed it. And Judge Harold Whitman leaned back slightly in his chair, no longer rushing, no longer treating the case like routine, his fingers resting on the closed file as though he needed a moment to process what he had just seen. And that pause, that hesitation, from someone who had shown none before, carried more weight than any spoken doubt. And Daniel Brooks felt it immediately, the shift in authority, the subtle but undeniable transfer of control that no one announced but everyone could feel. So he stepped forward again, but this time there was something different in his movement, less confidence, more urgency. "Your Honor, this is being misinterpreted," he said, his voice steady on the surface but strained underneath. "Those logs do not tell the full story." And for a moment, it sounded like he might recover, like he might regain the narrative. But the judge did not respond right away. Instead, he turned his gaze slowly toward Naomi Carter, and that alone changed everything. Because for the first time since this began, the court was not looking at her as the accused. It was looking at her as someone who might have answers. And Naomi did not rush to speak. She did not seize the moment with dramatic emphasis. She simply stood there, composed, her breathing even, her posture grounded, as if she had already anticipated this shift long before anyone else noticed it. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, controlled, and precise. "The logs do not need interpretation," she said. "They only need to be read in full." And the clarity of that statement cut through the tension like a quiet blade, because it removed the argument entirely. It suggested that the truth was not hidden. It had simply been overlooked, and that idea spread quickly through the room, changing the way people were thinking, the way they were watching, the way they were listening, and Daniel felt it slipping further now, that invisible ground beneath him becoming less stable with every second. "You are implying something serious," he said, turning toward her, trying to reframe the moment, to push it back into a space he could control. But Naomi did not respond directly to him. She kept her focus forward, toward the judge, toward the process itself, and that choice made his presence feel smaller, less central. And the man from federal oversight stepped forward again, not dramatically, not forcefully, but with enough intention to reinforce what was happening. "Your Honor, there is an additional component that has not yet been addressed," he said, and his tone carried the same quiet authority as before, the kind that did not need to demand attention because it naturally commanded it. And the judge nodded slightly, signaling for him to continue, and Daniel's head turned sharply, confusion and frustration mixing now in a way he could not fully hide, because this was no longer a contained case. This was something expanding beyond him, beyond his control, and the man continued. "The surveillance logs are only part of the record," he said. "There is also an access authorization sequence tied to the same time frame." And that phrase alone introduced something new, something more complex, and the judge leaned forward again, his interest fully engaged now. "What does it show?" he asked, and the man paused for just a moment, not for effect, but as if ensuring that the weight of what he was about to say would be understood. "It shows that the access was not initiated by the defendant," he said, and that sentence landed with quiet precision, not loud, not explosive, but undeniable, and the room reacted instantly, not with noise, but with attention, a collective shift, as every eye turned toward Daniel, because the implication was clear even if it had not yet been spoken directly. And Daniel felt it hit him fully now, that moment where denial no longer feels like certainty, but like resistance. "That is incorrect," he said quickly, almost reflexively, but the speed of his response betrayed him more than it helped, and Naomi finally turned her head toward him again, her expression unchanged, but her presence stronger now, more defined, and when she spoke, her voice carried a quiet finality that settled into the room like a closing door. "Then you should have nothing to worry about," she said, and for the first time, Daniel did not respond immediately, because something in that statement felt different, not like a challenge, not like a defense, but like a conclusion that had already been reached. And as the judge reopened the file, his movements deliberate, his attention fully focused, the realization began to take hold that this case was no longer about proving Naomi Carter guilty. It was about understanding how everything had been constructed in the first place. And Naomi, standing exactly where she had been from the beginning, knew that the next piece of the truth was not just going to shift the case, it was going to redefine it entirely. The moment the judge reopened the file, the energy in the courtroom shifted again, not sharply, but with a slow, undeniable pull, like gravity changing direction without warning. And this time no one spoke to interrupt it. Not the prosecutor, not the clerk, not even Daniel Brooks, who now stood still for a fraction too long, his silence louder than anything he had said before. And Judge Whitman's eyes moved carefully across the next section, his expression tightening in a way that suggested he was no longer searching for answers but confirming something he had already begun to suspect. And Naomi Carter remained exactly as she had been, calm, composed, but now there was a subtle difference, a quiet sense of inevitability in the way she stood, as if the outcome was no longer uncertain, only unfolding. And the judge finally spoke, slower than before, more deliberate. This authorization sequence, it does not just contradict the timeline, he said, pausing briefly as if choosing his words with precision. It identifies the source of access. And that sentence landed with a different kind of weight, not just doubt, not just inconsistency, but direction, and the room reacted instantly, a subtle shift forward, attention sharpening, because now there was something more than a question. There was a possibility of an answer, and Daniel felt it before it was said, that tightening in his chest, that instinctive resistance forming before logic could catch up. There must be an error in that system, he said quickly, his voice no longer as controlled as he intended, and the speed of his response did not strengthen his position. It weakened it, because now it sounded like avoidance instead of certainty, and the man from federal oversight did not step back this time. He remained where he was, steady, present, his voice calm as he added, "The system logs cannot be altered without leaving a trace." And that single statement closed a door that Daniel had not realized he was relying on, and the judge nodded slightly, his attention fixed on the document. "The access code used matches an assigned credential," he continued, his voice now carrying a quiet firmness that had not been there before, and the room held its breath again, because everyone understood what that meant even before the name was spoken. And Daniel's jaw tightened, his posture stiffening as if bracing for impact, and Naomi watched him, not with satisfaction, not with anger, but with a calm awareness that made the moment feel even heavier. And then the judge finished the sentence. "Officer Brooks, the access was initiated under your authorization." And the silence that followed was absolute, not empty, but full, dense with realization. And for a brief second, Daniel did not react at all, as if the words had not fully reached him, as if his mind was still searching for an alternative explanation, a different angle, something that could restore the structure he had built. But there was nothing, no immediate response, no clear path forward, only the weight of what had just been revealed. And the prosecutor shifted slightly in his seat, no longer leaning toward Daniel, no longer aligned with him in the same way. And that subtle movement did not go unnoticed, because it marked a change, not just in perception, but in position. And Naomi finally took a small step forward, not aggressively, not dramatically, just enough to signal that she was no longer simply standing within the process. She was now part of what was shaping it. And when she spoke, her voice was steady, precise, and impossible to ignore. "So the question is no longer whether something was found," she said, her eyes briefly meeting the judge's before returning forward, "but who placed it there?" And that shift reframed everything, not as a defense, not as an argument, but as a correction of the narrative itself. And the judge did not interrupt her, he did not redirect the moment, because now he was listening, fully, carefully, and Daniel felt it completely now, that loss of control, that moment, where the story he had constructed no longer held. And he opened his mouth to respond, to explain, to deny, but no words came immediately, because for the first time, he was no longer ahead of what was happening, he was reacting to it. And Naomi's gaze remained steady, her presence unwavering, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment from the very beginning. And somewhere deep in that silence, the realization began to take hold that this case was never about proving her guilt, it was about exposing something far more calculated. And as the judge leaned forward once more, preparing to speak again, the entire room understood that whatever came next would not just change the outcome, it would change who was standing on which side of the truth. The silence after the judge's words did not feel like the end of something. It felt like the beginning of something no one in that room was prepared to face. And for a long second, no one moved, not even Daniel Brooks, whose posture remained frozen in place as if the weight of what had just been said had not fully settled yet. And then it did, slowly, unmistakably, and it showed in the smallest details, the way his shoulders tightened, the way his breath changed, the way his eyes no longer scanned the room for control but searched for something else, something he could still hold on to. And Judge Whitman did not rush forward. He did not immediately deliver a conclusion. Instead, he leaned back slightly, his gaze fixed on Daniel now with a level of scrutiny that had not been there before. And that shift alone was enough to redefine the entire room, because authority had moved, quietly but completely. And Naomi Carter stood at the center of it without moving an inch, her presence now no longer passive, no longer observed, but acknowledged. And the judge spoke again, slower, more deliberate than at any point before. "Officer Brooks, you understand the implications of what has been presented," he said. And it was not a question, not really. But Daniel responded anyway, because silence was no longer an option. "This is a misinterpretation," he said. But the words came out thinner now, less certain. "There are multiple people with access. This does not prove anything." And for a brief moment, that argument hung in the air, searching for support. But it did not land the way it might have earlier, because now the room was no longer looking for explanations. It was looking for alignment, for consistency, for truth. And the man from federal oversight stepped forward again, not forcefully, not dramatically, but with a presence that made ignoring him impossible. "The access sequence is not the only factor," he said calmly. And as he spoke, he reached into a slim folder he had been holding, something no one had paid much attention to until now. And he placed a single document on the clerk's desk, and that simple action drew every eye in the room, because it introduced something new, something additional, something that had not yet been accounted for. And Daniel saw it, saw the movement, saw the document, and something inside him shifted again, sharper this time, because now it was not just about what had already been revealed. It was about what was still coming. And the judge gestured for the document to be passed forward, his attention fully locked in. And as the clerk handed it over, the room seemed to narrow, as if everything else had fallen away except for what was about to be read. And Naomi did not move, but her gaze followed the motion with quiet precision, as if she already knew what was written there, as if this moment was not a surprise but a step in a sequence she had already mapped out. And the judge read the first line silently, his expression tightening again, more noticeably this time. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a different tone, one that suggested the situation had moved beyond doubt entirely. "This indicates that the evidence log was amended after initial entry," he said, and the reaction in the room was immediate, a sharper intake of breath, a more visible shift. Because this was no longer about timing. It was about alteration, about intention. And Daniel stepped forward quickly, almost instinctively. "That is not accurate," he said, but the urgency in his voice now worked against him, not for him. And the man from federal oversight did not raise his voice, did not push. He simply added one more piece. "The amendment was made under the same authorization," he said. And that was it. That was the moment where everything aligned, where every inconsistency, every hesitation, every unanswered question converged into something clear, something undeniable. And Daniel felt it collapse around him, not suddenly, but completely, like a structure that had been holding just long enough to stand before finally giving way. And Naomi finally took another small step forward, her presence now fully integrated into the center of the room. And when she spoke, her voice carried that same calm certainty that had been there from the beginning, but now it sounded different. Now it sounded like the truth had caught up to the moment. "You did not just find the evidence," she said, her eyes steady on Daniel. "You rewrote the story around it." And the words did not need to be louder. They did not need to be repeated, because they settled into the room with finality. And for the first time since this began, Daniel had no immediate response, no clear direction, no control over what came next. And as the judge closed the file once more, his expression no longer neutral, no longer questioning, but resolve. The realization spread through the courtroom that the case had already turned, not with noise, not with force, but with something far more powerful. And Naomi Carter, standing exactly where she had been from the beginning, knew that the final piece had not yet been spoken, but it was already impossible to stop. The final silence did not feel empty. It felt complete, like every piece of the truth had finally found its place, and there was nothing left to hide behind. And Judge Whitman sat still for a moment longer, his hands resting on the closed file, his gaze steady and focused as he looked directly at Officer Daniel Brooks, no longer with uncertainty, no longer with hesitation, but with a clarity that left no room for interpretation. And when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a decision that had already been formed. "This court cannot proceed under these circumstances," he said, each word deliberate, measured, and final, and the impact of that statement rippled through the room instantly, not as noise, not as chaos, but as a quiet shift in understanding, because everyone present knew what it meant, not just for the case, but for everything that had led to this moment. And Daniel stood there, his posture rigid but no longer controlled, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and realization, as if he had been holding on to something that no longer existed. And for the first time, he did not speak, he did not interrupt, because there was nothing left to assert, nothing left to defend in the way he had before. And Naomi Carter remained steady, her presence unchanged on the surface, but now fully recognized in a way that could not be reversed. And the judge continued. "The evidence presented raises serious concerns regarding the integrity of this case," he said, his eyes moving briefly across the room before returning to Daniel. "And this matter will be referred for further review." And that was the moment the shift became irreversible, because authority had not just moved, it had redefined the entire situation, and the prosecutor lowered his gaze slightly, no longer aligned, no longer confident, and the clerk sat still, no longer shuffling papers, as if the process itself had paused to acknowledge what had just been revealed. And Naomi finally moved forward one last time, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to stand where she could be seen clearly by everyone in the room. And when she spoke, her voice carried a calm strength that did not demand attention but commanded it anyway. "You said no one was coming to save me," she said, her eyes resting on Daniel, steady and unshaken. "But this was never about being saved." And the words settled into the silence with quiet precision, because they reframed everything, not as a moment of rescue, but as a moment of exposure. And Daniel looked at her, really looked at her for the first time, not as a suspect, not as a problem to solve, but as someone he had completely misjudged. And that realization showed, not in a dramatic reaction, but in the absence of one, in the stillness that replaced his earlier certainty. And Naomi held his gaze for just a second longer before turning slightly toward the judge, her posture composed, her presence unwavering. And the man from federal oversight stepped forward once more, not to interrupt, not to take control, but to confirm what had already become clear. "Your Honor, we will proceed accordingly," he said, and the judge gave a small nod, signaling that the process had moved beyond the courtroom, beyond this moment, into something larger, something that would continue long after the room had emptied. And Naomi took a slow breath, not of relief, not of victory, but of completion, as if the purpose she had carried into that room had now been fulfilled. And as the tension finally began to release, as people shifted, as the weight of the moment settled into understanding, one truth remained unmistakable, not spoken loudly, not written on any page, but felt by everyone who had witnessed it, that the badge Daniel had relied on had not protected him from the truth, and the silence he once controlled had become the space where that truth was revealed. And as Naomi turned to leave, her steps steady, her head held high, the lesson lingered in the air long after she was gone. That power can shape a story for a moment, but truth decides how it ends.